Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bull Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex, as always, and we are here with ESPN's Jordan Reid to talk about the draft, everything coming out. He just got off of the pro day circuit, going all across the country. So, Jordan, how are you doing after that hectic week?
I'm good, man. Happy to be back home, settled. Really get to empty the notebook on everything. The pro day circuit really is a grind, but it's fun. Fun seeing these guys trying to achieve their careers, better their numbers, or seeing some guys for the first time really work out, whether it's just positional stuff or the testing numbers as well. Also, some good data points that we can add to our draft files and draft profiles of these guys as well.
I want to start there on the data points that I guess come out of pro days. We've seen a lot of distinction between some guys' measurements at the combine, some of their 40 times that they're running at like the combine versus the pro day, or Will Campbell's arms magically getting longer at his pro day. What do you kind of make of some of the discrepancy that we're seeing on that side?
Well, it makes things definitely much tougher, but every team is going to have the number that they go by, whether it's their own recorded information or during pro days. All the scouts at the pro day actually do a huge huddle, and they'll really come up with some numbers that are in the same neighborhood. So, for example, if one scout has a receiver running a 4.41 and another has a 4.43, the number that they'll write down is 4.42. So, just having
Hmm.
that consensus coming out of pro day, if they had numbers in the same neighborhood, they'll come up with a general consensus. And it's not just 40, it's other stuff as well. And of course, we have exact numbers for like vertical and broad jump. But if there's some questionable numbers about the 40 or, short shuttle or, things like that, three cones, some things like that, they will come up with a general consensus or certain neighborhood of numbers. So it's really tough. It makes things really harder on our end, especially from a media perspective. You don't really know what numbers to go by, but everybody's going to go by their own number, what they trust is to be the most accurate.
I mentioned, Will Campbell, who's generated a lot of discussion. Are there any other prospects in this class who, people look at the testing results and are a little, concerned about, I guess, believing what they're seeing based off of the tape or other things that they've watched versus how these guys are testing?
He's the only one that immediately comes to mind that's like super controversial that we went back and forth about. But there's been other guys that have had inconsistent like hand size. I think Milrow
Mm.
had under 9-inch hands at the Senior Bowl, and then at Combine, his hands came over 9 inches. So it's just little discrepancies like that that make things really challenging.
Got to work the hand grippers right before you
Yeah.
get out there. Let's get into some of the stuff regarding the top of the draft. You wrote your last mock draft, I think, on March 4th. Has anything from this combine process, the pro day circuits, has anything of like the top 20-ish in the first round before the Chargers are on the board, I guess, changed a lot in that time period?
There hasn't been a whole bunch that changed, but we've definitely gotten more information. Of course, the Will Campbell arm length, you talked about it. We've seen some quarterbacks throw at pro days, and we've seen some guys really show up to pro days that were injured. That was a bit of a surprise. Like, for example, Jahai Campbell from Alabama. Nobody knew that he went ahead and got the labrum surgery, and he shows up
Mm.
with his arm in a sling. So that's why I
Oh,
like going to these pro days and you know seeing these prospects up close as well, just because there's some guys that had certain events or certain things that happen to them that you don't really know about that you factor into the equation for their evaluation as well. And that's not to say that it's going to be swayed by multiple rounds or even a round or anything like that, but it's just more things that you add to their draft portfolio.
right. Getting into your mock draft from last month, you had Omarion Hampton with the 22nd pick, and then Mason Taylor in the second round for the Chargers. Obviously, that was written before free agency. They go out and sign Najee Harris. Does that signing, I guess, move you in a way where you probably go, maybe they're not a first round team for running back? Or does that contract length and the fact that he got a 1 year deal kind of make you even, I guess, more bullish on the fact that that still could be a possibility for them in round one?
I don't think it changed anything, honestly, especially with it being a 1 year deal and really how deep this running back class is. And I think we have two guys at the top that are first round worthy, obviously Genty, then also Hampton as well. But I always like to really cater my fits, my prospects to certain draft teams or certain draft fits as well. When I'm looking at Greg Roman's offense, I think Omarion Hampton is tailor made
Right.
for that offense, just because you have somebody that can that can run in that man gap power scheme. With the love that Greg Roman likes with the power game, I think Omarion Hampton fits really well in that. So that was my thinking behind putting Hampton there. And then also, the Chargers just don't have any consistent weapons outside of Lab McConkey, in my honest opinion, as far as somebody that Herbert can go to. With Mason Taylor, he's kind of that wide receiver slash tight end that I think pairs really well with McConkey. So that was my thinking behind both of those picks and why I slotted them, both of them, to the Chargers.
Yeah, I think definitely after the Houston playoff game, there is an immediate need to get weapons on this team. They did a couple things in free agency here and there to kind of solidify the offensive line, bring Mike Williams back, but there's definitely a need to get, I think, younger talent, certainly in the building. Are there any other fits past the first two rounds that you're kind of looking for? I know you mentioned last year when we talked, you mentioned Braylon Allen as a potential kind of Jim
Yeah.
Harbaugh, Greg Roman guy. Any other fits that you're kind of looking down the board day 2, day 3 that you think could really pair well, either with Justin Herbert or Jesse Minter's defense?
When I look at the running back class, Damian Martinez out of Miami is somebody that I think pairs really well as far as that can run in that man gap power scheme. Ollie Gordon, the third, if you're looking for a later on down the line running back that I think projects really well in that scheme as well. Tight end wise, I think it's a really deep running back class. Somebody like Harold Fannin is somebody that you probably get in the third or the fourth round. Luke Lachey out of Iowa is another down the line tight end that I think can give you something as far as a pass catcher, then also a blocker as well. So they're going to have their pick of the litter as far as some later on guys that I think they can add to be some young talent, whether it's at running back, tight end, and then some other areas that they could look to address as well.
You touched on the blocking there, and I'm curious what you sort of make of some of the discussion regarding, for example, a prospect like Colston Loveland, who's a dynamic receiver, can kind of do it all. But there are, I think, some questions people have about his blocking ability. Harold Fannin is kind of another one who's a very, I wouldn't say controversial, but people have kind of different takes on him depending on where his fit is in the right offense. What do you kind of make, I guess, in this Harbaugh Roman, offense of like what a tight end sort of needs to do if like they strictly kind of want a guy who is both a good pass catcher and blocker, or if it's a little bit more flexible based around the guys that they have there?
And that's why, to me, it's so important to differentiate the tight ends in the draft, just because you have some guys that are what I like to call F tight ends, or those flexed out guys like a Colston Loveland or a Harold Fannin. Even I would put Elijah Arroyo in that bucket as
Mm-hmm.
well, even though I think he's a serviceable blocker. But where he's going to make his most money is as a pass catcher, as opposed to somebody who is a true traditional Y tight end, like a Tyler Warren or a Gunnar Helm or even a Terrence Ferguson in a sense as well can give you something as a blocker. But that's why I think it's so important to really differentiate the types of tight ends, just because you always want to cater to their skill set and where they're going to where you're able to maximize their abilities. Just because if not, if you're playing back and forth, is really essentially making them learn two positions. And that's why I think, and Brock Bowers was incredible, but I think the Raiders really embraced his receiving prowess. And that's why you were able to see him put up so many numbers, as opposed to somebody like the Atlanta Falcons, where you're trying to force Cal Pitts to be a blocker and then trying to force him to be a
Right.
pass catcher as well. You're really trying to force him to learn two jobs in one. And is really struggling and really stunning his growth as far as his development. He really hasn't been the guy that a lot of people, including myself, really projected him to be. So I think it's important that you really differentiate and you put these guys into different buckets, whether they're an F tight end or a Y tight end.
Yeah, and I think the blocking thing is a little bit overstated also in the Chargers getup because they have Will Disley on the roster who they kind of
Mm-hmm.
signed to be their, competent C gap blocker. Like he's going to do that stuff for you. So like I think the idea that Colston Loveland needs to be elite or Harold Fannin needs to be elite in that capacity when they can give you, like you mentioned with Bowers, so much in the receiving game, irrespective of their blocking. I think is something that maybe is a little bit overstated, especially if they are kind of the best players available at the points that they're available in the draft. Quarterback is interesting. I think in this draft, obviously you kind of have the two guys at the top in Ward and Sanders. And I want to bring this up from a Chargers standpoint, just because it's not something a ton of people talk about, but there is this um, dart trade up, like scenario that could happen at the back end of the first round that a lot of people have discussed, with kind of where the Chargers are picking there, kind of in that 20, 21, 22 range as far as when that could happen. Do you buy a lot of smoke that you'll get that third quarterback in the first round? And if so, is one of the teams kind of in that range? Could they be the team that sort of trades back with a team that's wants their quarterback in that slot?
I definitely think it's possible, but the Chargers are a couple of picks too late. Now, if they were at 20
Hmm.
ahead of the Steelers, then I think they would be in a really good spot for a team potentially to trade up for Jackson Dart, assuming that he's still on the board. So they're a couple of picks too late, in my opinion, but you never know. There's always a scenario of where a team could look to trade up if Pittsburgh does pass on a quarterback, assuming one is available at number 21 overall and somebody wants to go ahead and trade up to acquire Jackson Dart or whoever it may be. The Chargers are definitely in a good spot, but it's a couple of picks too late just because
Right.
every team, especially quarterback needy teams, they go down the draft or the list and they really put a red dot beside which teams potentially could take a quarterback, especially in round one. And you better believe a lot of teams have already earmarked number 20 overall ahead of the Steelers if they want to trade back into the first round to get that third guy off of the board.
Yeah, we'll see what Aaron Rodgers does when he eventually makes his decision,
Yeah.
and what could affect kind of the Steelers' decision making there. But yeah, I think quarterback is kind of one of the most interesting things in this draft, just because, like last year, even though that was a much more stacked quarterback class compared to this one, there's all the talk about like, I don't know if Bo Nix or Michael Penix are going to go in the first round, and then they go where they go in the
The top
draft,
12,
and
right?
we sort of act surprised when it happens, but it does feel like it happens every year where those guys go higher than they should. Um, when we talk about sort of the Chargers defense here, a couple key losses. You have Joey Bosa, who left to the Bills. You have Puna Ford, who left to the Rams. Um, who are some of the trench guys you would kind of earmark, as you said, as guys who could be fits for them at edge, defensive tackle, trying to kind of build this defense out a little bit? Not necessarily, I mean, they were a very good defense last year. They don't need to improve to that extent, but in terms of, replacing some of their key departures in free agency.
Yeah, they've kind of patchworked it as far as the interior over the past year or so. Like guys with, like Tier Tart and Puna Ford, and they've gotten really good production out of a lot of those guys. And I think that was one of the biggest surprises for you guys last year as
Oh,
far
yeah.
as the run defense, especially up the middle, just because coming into the year, there were a lot of people that projected taking a defensive tackle up the middle. And I mean, that still is the case. And there's a lot of players in this year's draft class of where they could look to take. And I mean, I wouldn't be mad if they double dip at the position. I definitely think there's a circumstance of where they could double dip at defensive tackle. And I'm looking at guys like Tyleek Williams out of Ohio State, somebody that is going to come in and really improve your run defense right away. Alfred Collins is another guy that I think is very scheme versatile. He can play in that 3-down defensive front. He can also play that one technique and be that one gap presence as well. So there's a lot of different areas that they could look to go. They could look to take a run stuffer and then look to take what I like to call a DPR, which is just a designated pass rusher as well, just so you can get some more juice along the inside as well as getting your run stuffer. But those are two names. Jamari Caldwell out of Oregon is another name that I think is really intriguing for the Chargers as well, especially if you're looking for a guy that can give you a little bit of something as a pass rusher, but he's going to improve your run defense from day one.
Yeah, I think they're definitely planning on double dipping in this class. If Jim Harbaugh's comments yesterday were any indication, you don't want to listen to coach speak, but he did outwardly say like there were double the amount of defensive tackles that there were usually at the combine. So it does feel like this is the year, and maybe not why you do let Puna Ford or guys like that walk in free agency, but you kind of have the ability to sort of supplant it, specifically in this class and kind of rebuild your roster back up if that's, if the price is a little bit too high for you. And like you mentioned, I think that, Poona Ford and the production they got out of Tier Tart, all big surprises last year. They signed Poona Ford around this time last year,
Yeah.
kind of March, April, like late free agency. And in, Minter's defense, he puts up the production that he does. So I think they feel confident they sign Naquan Jones as well as Deshaun Hand in free agency as guys who sort of can, play some snaps, sort of replace some of the production you lost. And then, either you take one defensive tackle, double down in this draft, certainly at DT. Edge, I think, is the most interesting one, is sort of I don't want to say first round need, but your edge rushing room right now is Khalil Mack, who came back on a 1-year deal, who's contemplated retirement kind of a few times. Joey Bosa, like I mentioned, left. In terms of I guess there's not a lot of predicting that the Chargers will go edge in the first round out there in the mock draft community, but they have met with Ezra Rocco from Boston College. Who are some of the, if they were to go high priority edge rusher in first and second rounds, who are some of the guys that you think could surprise a few people if the Chargers decided to call their name in round 1, round 2?
Yeah, I think Ezra Rocco definitely is one name that is worthy. Mike Green out of Marshall is another that I think could really intrigue them, assuming that he's still on the board at 22. Second round more so, I think that's where a lot of the depth in this year's class is, outside of course, the top guys at the top of the board. But like a Landon Jackson out of Arkansas, I think that's another that Harbaugh will like quite a bit. But one I think is going to like a lot is JT Tuimoloau out of Ohio State, just because you know exactly what you're getting with him. Really strong hands. Is more of a power rusher as opposed to somebody that's really bendy. He's not an overly bendy guy outside of a spin move that it really likes to deploy. But you know exactly what you're getting with Tuimoloau. Is really stout against the run as far as setting the edge. More so of a power rusher, like I said, as well. But as far as somebody that can contribute from day one, I definitely think Landon Jackson and Tuimoloau are definitely in that similar tier. And then you're getting into guys like a Braden Swinson out of LSU. I think is really underrated in this year's class. That'll probably go late second, early third round, if I had to guess. And then you're getting into your DPRs, your undersized guys like a Josiah Stewart, Femi Oladejo out of UCLA. Then Princely Umamielen out of Ole Miss is somebody that they could look to find intriguing as well. And like the third or the fourth round, that's where I think he ends up going.
You think third or fourth round? I'm curious where the consensus is, because he's another guy that I feel like has gone up the draft boards like a lot, to the point where he's being mocked in like the second round in some of these.
Yeah.
Is there like a reason for the discrepancy there, or?
It's just the testing with him. I think he has some ankle flexion or ankle stiffness in his game. And the opinions are going to vary. Like I have him as a third round pick. There's going to be some teams that have him as a second round pick, and there's others that have him as a day 3 guy. That's the fun part about the draft community. But if he goes in the second round, would that be surprising? No, not at all. Just speaking of where I have him projected, I have him as a third round pick right now.
Okay. You mentioned Josiah Stewart, who obviously is worth mentioning as a guy that has gotten a lot accomplished, even though he is a little bit undersized, and Jim Harbaugh intimately familiar with him and what he could bring to this defense. I think Tuimoloau is a good call there, just because of what he can do as far as shoring up your run defense quite a lot, and sort of raising the floor there, kind of like we mentioned earlier in terms of bringing in Poona and Tier and a lot of these guys that sort of helped the Chargers become the level of run defense that they were last year. Also would be great to hear national NFL commentators talk about Tuimoloau and Tuipulotu and try to do that while they're commentating
back to back, right?
Yeah, fun to say back to back. And we'll get a couple speech lessons with some of them. I'll sort of finish off on this. If I don't want to spoil your mock draft coming out on the 21st, which you can read on ESPN.com once that does come out. But who are some of the, I guess if you do have a new favorite, or if Hampton is still your guy, who do you think the Chargers ultimately take right now at 22? I know it's harder to say than last year, where it was just
Yeah.
like, okay, you just had the 4 guys, and then it was alter a wide receiver. But if you had to predict on April 1st right now who it is, then who is it?
Put me on the spot. So I have not.
Yeah.
I always wait to the last minute to do my mock drafts. Excuse me, just because I don't like to overthink it, especially when I'm starting on it early on. I don't like to plan ahead just because I like to get all my thoughts together, do as much homework as possible on all of these teams, and then I'm a big trend studier. Like, what are some of the
Mm,
trends that Harbaugh has had in previous drafts, and also Joe Ortiz as well. And it's still too early in their tenure to really develop as far as the trends that they have had, especially with this only being Ortiz's second draft. So there really isn't a trend that you can really pick up on. So we're still going off of guys that really fit the scheme that they're in. But I look at Omarion Hampton, man. I just say this is a guy that really fits them really well. But the Najee Harris signing, and I know we talked about it earlier as far as not really affecting their draft board early on, but I think they could look to wait to go running back, especially with them having 10 picks, I believe it is. I don't think
mm.
there's going to be the urgency to really select one early on. And this is just my hunch. That's not any inside information or anything like that. But if I had to guess, I think they're going to add to the defensive line somehow, some way. And I think Harbaugh is just going to look at this defensive line class and see somebody like a Kenneth Grant out of Michigan, somebody that he is very familiar with, that I think really shores up their run game aspect as far as in the middle of their defense really early on. And if there's one coach that knows the ins and outs of Kenneth Grant, it definitely would be Harbaugh. So
Mike
Kenneth Grant,
Elston,
I definitely,
Mike Elston there as a defensive line
yeah,
coach too.
absolutely. They have a lot of intel as far as how he ticks, what makes his mind go, and then just how much he loves football as well. So Kenneth Grant or some type of defensive lineman is probably the way that I'm going to go in the mock draft.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you mentioned about like trends specifically, and the fact that we really only have 1 year of draft data. Like, you can go back to the Baltimore stuff for sure, where Joe Ortiz came from, but I think there's a lot of fans or prognosticators who go, they're not going to take a wide receiver in the first round. They didn't do it last year, right? Or just some of the things that happened in the draft last year maybe being overvalued as far as what they'll do this year in a different class, where running back and defensive tackle, and a lot of those positions are deeper, but some of the positions that were top tier are a little bit weaker comparatively, just speaking. So yeah, thanks for joining us today, Jordan. You can read his mock draft coming out on ESPN back on the 21st. And I hope you have a very good rest of your draft season. Any final thoughts on kind of what the Chargers end up doing in this draft and get out of their 10 picks or so?
The trenches, man. The trenches is always the way to go when you're talking about Harbaugh and a Harbaugh-based team. We saw it. We sat here 365 days ago debating Malik Neighbors or Joe Alt, and they ended up going Joe Alt, and that pick ended up working out very well in their favor. So I'm always going to bet on them taking a trench player, especially early on.
Bet on the trenches. You heard it from ESPN's Jordan Reid first. Thanks for joining, Jordan. And as always, bolt up.